rich people, always flying off somewhere.
Hey everyone.
Hey everyone.
It's the Vegan Vanguard.
Maxie and Maureen. Still don't have a new intro.
Still stumbling over the intro. So what up?
What up, what up?
What's new?
But I realized last time we didn't say for new listeners what our podcast was about. So
That's true.
Our podcast is about all things from the... All right, for those of you who don't know, that was our last intro. But we talk about veganism and anti-capitalism and feminism from a pro-intersectional, leftist, anti-speciesist, anti-racist, anti-all the good stuff. I mean, all the bad stuff. Anti-all the bad stuff. Perspective.
Yeah. Great summary.
Thanks.
It's basically just one big leftist vegan, I don't know,
Utopia?
cornucopia. Cornucopia.
Yeah. So today we are going to talk about antinatalism and antinatalism both in the vegan community and outside of it. Basically, we're going to try to tackle and dispel or critically analyze all different sides of the antinatalist arguments that we frequently come across.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we're going to look at it in the vegan movement, as you said, and then also in the anti-capitalist movement, and just kind of break down all these arguments for and against antinatalism.
Mm-hmm.
So I think we're going to start just by talking about what antinatalism is, because I think there's a difference between antinatalism as a movement and just somebody not wanting kids. Like,
oh,
yeah. Like, yeah, we just want to start by saying we're not saying that people have to have kids or that it's wrong to not want kids. Like, this is totally not what we're saying at all. I actually never wanted kids for most of my life. So yeah, so that's, just to say that I fully understand anyone's personal reasons for not wanting kids. But I think antinatalism is a little bit different. It seems to be kind of based on this philosophy that life itself is suffering. I was reading an article talking about David Benatar, a philosopher in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Cape Town. Shout out Cape Town. I love Cape Town. But anyway, he wrote a book called Better Never to Have Been: The Harm of Coming into Existence. And he writes, while good people go to great lengths to spare their children from suffering, few of them seem to notice that the one and only guaranteed way to prevent all the suffering of their children is not to bring those children into existence in the first place. And he goes on to say that life is an escalating list of woes. We're almost always hungry or thirsty. When we're not, we must go to the bathroom. We often experience thermal discomfort. We're too hot or too cold.
Yes. That is the biggest source of discomfort in my life. I'm always too cold.
Definitely. Or we are tired and unable to nap. Like, yeah, preach. Like, come on. We suffer from itches, allergies, and colds, menstrual pains. Yes. Or hot flashes.
Never mind. End of podcast. We are anti-natalist.
Yeah, I know. Exactly right.
Now that this dude makes all these great arguments.
Oh my God, he brought up menstrual pains. Yes. Yeah, no, he's like, life is a procession of frustrations and irritations, waiting in traffic, standing in line, filling out forms, forced to work. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
We often find our jobs exhausting. Even those who may enjoy their work may have professional aspirations that remain unfulfilled. Many lonely people remain single, while those who marry fight and divorce. People want to look, be, and feel younger, and yet they age relentlessly. I mean, where's the lie?
Right, but talk about like really not targeting the root of the issue here. Like we're forced to work and plus we're forced to endure global warming and aging, and it's like or we could live without all those things if we lived with a different system.
Absolutely. I mean, it's completely bourgeois too. It's like your biggest worries during the day are maybe being too hot or too cold, and perhaps
I
having to
mean,
stand in line and fill out some
right.
forms. This is the bane of your existence. Like
Hmm.
you would rather have not been born than be forced to stand in lines or go into traffic. Like, are you kidding me? But sorry, not to like make light of the anti-natalist movement of
Right.
people who are like, hey, hey. I mean, full disclosure, neither of us are part of this movement, so we're just trying to learn about it. But anyway, antinatalism seems to be like coming from a place of more substantial, like wanting to create kind of a movement, wanting to, ground this in this philosophical idea of whether or not humans should be living. And then I know for some people that kind of branches out into like environmentalism and stuff like that, where it's like, should humans be living because we are quote unquote cancer on the earth and we're just spreading and destroying everything? So I think people who look at it from that frame are moving beyond this idea just of personal suffering or like personal irritation of like, well, life is just irritating, so I like it's immoral to bring a human into the world.
Hmm.
When you start to get into like the environmental kind of reasons, then it becomes a bit more broad. It's like, well, it's immoral because it's going to contribute to the degradation of the earth and the degradation of living conditions for other people, I guess. But
And that's how I've heard it being spoken about in the vegan movement. And that's very much how the argument is made. It's not only that humans are hurting other animals and hurting the earth, so they just should not be born, and it's immoral to bring other humans into the world for that reason. But also, I mean, vegans definitely take it one step further, or some anti-natalist vegans say that, well, definitely for people who are not vegan, it's unethical to bring another human into the world that won't be vegan. But
mm-hmm,
also, even when you're a vegan parent, you have no guarantee that your child will remain vegan. So why bring them into the world at all? Like, as if being vegan in this industrialized food system and just world in general is the only reason for like considering whether or not
mm-hmm,
someone has the right to live.
mm-hmm. Yeah,
It's
that's
wild.
so, I mean, ignorant to so many things. I mean, yeah, your child could be raised vegan and they could also be buying chocolate from, slave labor of children
Hmm.
around the world. They could be buying palm oil and destroying everything, right? Like, I don't know, your child being vegan. And I mean, I think we might get into this as well with the idea of like consumerist veganism, but your child being vegan isn't really even having that that
Oh yeah.
like like they're not saving a ton of animals like
No.
your child being vegan. So,
No,
yeah.
I even take issue with the whole idea of being vegan saves animals. We'll get, and I mean, being a consumerist vegan saves a quantifiably
Hmm.
insurable number of animals. I mean, that's definitely not why I'm vegan, and I'm not even sure I'll ever know if have saved a single animal over my hopefully long, long life as a vegan. So
Hmm.
yeah, and in that same vein, you could be not vegan and living, for example, in Bangladesh,
Hmm.
and have a tiny, tiny fraction of the environmental footprint of a vegan living in a, quote unquote first world nation. So,
Hmm. Hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, it's like it's pretty sick when you see vegans kind of taking it to that extreme where it's like just looking at population in general and not looking at environmental impact whatsoever and thinking that people in the third world who are quote unquote overpopulated are
mhm.
the ones that need to be controlled. They are the ones who need to be antinatalist. They're the ones, contributing to the problems that they're facing in climate change, etc.
Yeah, and I think that a lot of, well, I'm a pretty young vegan in the grand scheme of things. I've been vegan for like a little under 5 years. So I feel like I was I came into the age of veganism through a lot of Durian Ryder and Freely's YouTube teachings. I like knew the movement
Didn't we all?
quite well. And I wonder if this is a little bit less present now. I certainly, like, I think it is, but that's just maybe because I've really, really distanced myself from that community. But then again, I feel like so has everyone. But the idea of antinatalism was also really, really strongly used to advocate in favor of vasectomies. I feel like every vegan guy who like became vegan around the same time as me got a vasectomy. I sometimes I have thoughts for those people, and I'm like, what do they? Are they still happy with their vasectomy?
I know. Actually, it's so funny. Like doing some research for this video, I actually did like kind of a deep dive of those videos from like Vegan Gains and Durian Rider, and it was so painful to watch them and Freely, and then they're all talking about how like it's you should not be having sex unless you have a vasectomy, and why would you want to be a parent, and everything you were just saying about even if you do parent a child and they're vegan, they might not be vegan forever, and so therefore they'll be hurting animals, and that's that goes against the vegan ethos of wanting to do no harm.
Totally. And well, I feel like now we're maybe diving down a rabbit hole that is too specific for some of the listeners. It would be interesting to know how many of our listeners like actually know Durian Rider and Freely and were also like part of that whole YouTube thing for a minute. But a lot of vegans, along with being antinatalist, along with advocating for vasectomies, also advocate exclusively for adopting children. I made a video a while ago on my channel, A Privileged Vegan, about like the business of adoption in general. And so I'm not really going to get into all the research now, but we'll link it in the show notes. But vegans, I heard this stat regurgitated so many times that there's 150 million orphans in the world, and why would we ever have our own kids? Because not only might they not be vegan, but also bringing in another child to the world is not vegan. And there's a whole bunch of, like, that stat is a lie. There's actually closer to 13 million actual orphans in the world. And a lot. 13 instead of 150 million.
That seems so low.
Yeah. Yeah, because a lot of kids in orphanages are not orphans at all. Because the business of adoption, of like people in first world countries wanting to adopt children in third world countries, God, I hate that distinction, but or an underdeveloped, whatever. I don't know how to call it.
Global North, Global South.
Global North, Global South. But I also feel like there must be something, like something that's problematic about that dichotomy too.
I mean, they're all problematic.
They're all problematic, yeah. So, yeah, someone from the global north adopting a child from the global south on average is going to spend $46,000 doing so, because of adoption fees, and it is basically it funds an entire economy that a lot of people in the global south are dependent on. And so either children are literally ripped away from their families to be in orphanages, or families give up, quote unquote, give up their child in order, because they think they'll have a better life, or they'll like get some kind of pay in exchange. So the entire business of adoption is really fucked up. And obviously not every adoption is exactly the same. I'm painting things in very broad strokes right now. Families getting ripped apart is fueled by colonialism and war and illness and all of these much deeper problems that adoption really doesn't address and shouldn't be. It's ridiculous to pose it as the solution to all of these problems. And same with antinatalism, it's really not addressing the root issue to say, oh, well, our world is such shit that we just shouldn't have children, instead of I just feel like it distracts us from really looking at, okay, well, why is it such shit? Like, how can we change the system? It's just,
Yeah, and I mean, like, that's not to say that like adoption is not a good idea or whatever, because adopting a child is not necessarily a bad thing, but like seeing that as any kind of activism, or seeing that as, yeah, we're doing this because this is the moral thing to do, and if you are having your own child, then therefore you are immoral. I think that's such a ridiculous thing to say, considering, like, as you just said, like the political economy of what's going on, war.
yeah. And for me, like the just what I was saying about adoption is just that the business of adoption is
Yeah,
incredibly fucked up, and
yeah.
way more so than I ever imagined before I researched for this video and also talked to an adoptee and joined a few groups on Facebook that like really helped me see that it's a much, much, much bigger and more complex issue than I ever thought it was. Like I don't even know the right way to adopt someone anymore. But yeah, it's just ironic that you see all these vegans saying like, just adopt, just adopt, just adopt.
No, it's so true. And it's true. I mean, I didn't know that much about it until I saw your video on it. So just like shout the video, people should go watch it. Because yeah, growing up, I mean, I didn't want kids, and I was in the same kind of mindset.
Mm-hmm.
I was thinking that a child raised in the global north is going to have so much more of an impact on the global health than someone born somewhere else. So why would I bring a new child into the world when there are already children who need a home, So, well, quote unquote, need a home. Perhaps they already have a home, but they're being sold or whatever. So yeah, I mean, I totally understand that mindset.
Well, from an ecological perspective, I don't even see how that would make sense because a poor child from the global south, raised in one of our industrialized nations is still going to have the same footprint.
Yeah, yeah. No, I wasn't necessarily saying I would adopt someone from the global south. Um,
Mm.
I just imagined like adopting someone here or whatever.
Hmm.
But I felt like because they're already here, like they would already have that footprint here anyway.
Hmm.
So I might as well raise them instead of bringing another child into the global north.
Yeah.
But you're right. If someone was thinking, oh, I'll just adopt someone from the global south, then that makes no sense at all, because then, yeah, you are increasing their footprint
Yeah.
hugely by bringing them over here.
Right. I think it's because I think it's the simplistic mindset that even the idea that overpopulation is what's environmentally fucking us over, like that it's
Hmm.
just about reducing the number of humans on this earth. So I guess if you're under that impression, really, I wanted to be less polite and say delusion, I see how people think, oh, well, I'm just going to adopt a child from like the global south and
Hmm.
raise them because they would think, oh, it's going to benefit ecology just by not bringing another child into the world. But that's really not the problem because the footprint of a a person can vary from like 1 to 100,
Yeah.
based on like where they're living in the world. So it's just really not about the number.
Even more than that, it was like 165 between the USA and somewhere like Rwanda or Chad.
Yeah. Wow.
So,
Yeah, because you made that. I was actually pulling. Maxi has an amazing overpopulation video on her channel, and yeah, you quoted the stat more exactly.
yeah, so it's like you could raise 165 children, or more than that, in Somalia with the same ecological footprint as one child raised in North America, for example. And so, yeah, the idea that, oh, I'm going to help I'm going to help the global ecology by not having my own child, but bringing a child from the developing world here. It's like, that doesn't make any sense. You're just increasing their ecological footprint 165 times.
Yeah. Oof, that is a bleak way to look at it. Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, just
Yeah.
if that's your argument for why you're doing it, then it's like, well, look at it, like take that to its conclusion. Like, what, you know what I mean?
Yeah. And you will see that the problem is capitalism and the distribution and production of our goods,
Yeah.
and not how many people we are. And
Hmm.
that's not to dismiss, like, I do think that there's something pretty messed up about how much we like tell humans, and especially women, that they should, keep the species going or have their own kids. Like, I do think that there is something
Mm-hmm.
pretty messed up about the perceived importance of having your own child and,
Yes.
perpetuating your biological legacy.
Mm-hmm.
And I definitely feel like I was socialized with that, and I'm really trying to unlearn it. Because I think that it's very kind of egotistical and just, I don't know. I don't like that either.
No, no, it's ridiculous. And as I said, for most of my life, I didn't actually want to have my own child. I wanted to adopt. But with my ex-partner, I feel like it's also that men are very socialized into thinking that it's like they need to pass on their seed and like
Hmm.
it's important. Yeah, a lot of men that I've been with, it's been very important for them to have their own real child, like to
Hmm.
have their child. And I'm like, that's kind of strange because I was thinking like, well, what about adoption? And then a lot of men are really not into that. So I don't think it's even
Hmm.
just the women who are socialized. It's like men have this strong like I
True.
must pass on my genes and like what the hell for?
Totally.
And I mean the whole like nature nurture argument, I don't know. I feel like nurture really plays a huge role. It really really does. And so I don't know. Yeah. I think that's also part of like the arrogance of humankind in
Mm.
general to think that we need to pass our genes on and to procreate and to pass our species on like for whatever the hell reason. Like I'm not sure. But
Hmm. Yeah, and regarding what you were saying with men and needing to pass on their seed, I also feel like that's really perpetuated with last
mhm.
names, like how
Yes.
women need to have their last name and how their kids are going to have their last name. And I used to joke when I was little, like, about I didn't even question that normally I should give up my last name. I was like really upset about the fact like I wasn't going to be able to. I used to tell my brother, like, you need to have kids because I'm not going to be able to pass on the family name. Like,
Yeah.
what?
No, same here. I
Um,
was upset about that too. I was like, no, but like my name should be passed down.
yeah. And I do feel a strong attachment to my last name.
Yeah.
I mean, it's my goddamn name. Like, every woman feels attached to her name.
And like we're
No?
the ones birthing the kids and then they don't even have our last name.
Like,
Come
fuck
on.
that. Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah. And so, just this whole idea of like descendants and lineage is so patriarchal anyway.
Hmm.
That, yeah.
Yeah, I know. It's just one of those things where it's like there is no good reason for that other
Hmm.
than just ego.
Absolutely.
So,
And maybe now is a good time to segue into the fact that I feel like this entire patriarchal idea of needing to procreate and pass on pass on your seed
hmm.
is ultimately only in favor of capitalism and in
Mm.
favor of just creating like a larger labor pool and also more consumers who will buy those goods. Mexi, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
Sure. So, a point that I made in my overpopulation video is that capitalism, as an ever-growing system, needs an ever-growing pool of labor in order to keep itself going, in order to keep accumulation going. People have commented to me and said, no, no, capitalism can keep going even if there is a reduction of population because we can just automate jobs. And when I say keep capitalism going, I mean that capitalism, in order to reproduce itself successfully, it has to grow by, I think, 3.6% every year. And so that means accumulation has to grow by that much every year. And the way that we accumulate profits is through quote unquote exploitation of resources and laborers. And so if you don't have an ever growing pool of labor to exploit, then labor's power with respect to capital grows, and therefore they can demand better wages and et cetera. And so that decreases profitability and decreases the potential for accumulation. So I've made a video about this. It's called The Reserve Army of Labor. And it just explains how capitalism only grows by making more and more people superfluous to the capitalist system, and by growing that pool of low wage, precarious workers that are available to do that really low wage work in order to benefit the capitalists, in order to keep accumulation going at that rate every year. And so, yes, if the population drops, then yeah, I mean, you can replace jobs with robots, but that is going to hinder capitalist growth and reproduction in another way. That, if you replace everyone with robots, then you don't have any actual consumers. Like, the demand for the consumer goods drops, and then that hinders profits and accumulation. And so that would destabilize capitalism in another way. So yeah, you either need an ever-growing population, an ever-growing pool of labor, or you're going to automate everything, and then capitalism is just going to implode. So that's not going to work either. So just addressing people who love me those kinds of comments. But yeah, it's this system, and also this system that produces all these things, produces all this food in gross excess, and then wastes it all while people are starving. I mean, this is the problem. This is why we're cutting down all the rainforests when that doesn't make sense, for the future of the planet. This is why we're drilling for oil in the sensitive Arctic, even when that makes no sense for the survival of the planet and our species. Like, this is why we're doing all of these things that make no actual sense for people or the planet. We're doing all of this because we're living in this profit-oriented system where a class of owners exploits a class of workers in order to make money for money's sake, for no other fucking purpose. That's why. So this whole thing about overpopulation, I mean, actually population is set to decrease. If you look at the projections, they're actually projecting that population is going to level off and then start to decrease. It's already decreasing in a lot of the more advanced nations.
Well, yeah, and the more advanced nations freak out whenever their populations start to stagnate and decrease for exactly all the reasons that Mexi just brought up. And a lot of these countries actually have pro-natalist policies where they give tax incentives, financial incentives, labor incentives to women who will, like, in order to get them to have babies, because it's really, really bad for an economy premised on eternal growth to have a population that's not exponentially growing at the same rate.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then, like, the whole everyone's losing their mind about letting refugees in, and so not surprised that they're having these policies to, yeah, let's have the European women make more babies and and deny all of the refugees seeking refuge and a better life, etc. So
well, yeah, that would entail a redistribution of wealth, whereas they'd rather just the wealthy families have more babies.
Yeah.
In order to keep the capitalist class afloat.
Yeah, so I mean, yeah, I mean we've made a series of videos about this, so I feel like we can like shout all of our videos, but I mean it's just very clear that we're not going to solve any of the problems that we're talking about. I mean, like, for people who think of antinatalism, maybe not necessarily as like an end in itself, but as something that perhaps you just don't feel like you want to bring in a child into this world because you're like me and you're really worried about what's going to happen around 2050 with like all of our global ecological systems. And you're like, hey, I don't really know if I want to have a child, have to like suffer through that. It's one thing to be like, okay, yeah, this is my personal choice, my personal thought or whatever. But then when it becomes this idea of like, the only way to stop this is to not have children.
And shaming other people who have children.
Right, shaming other people who have children, being like, you are the one causing the problem. It's like, no, people having babies is not the problem. Like, people having babies is not the problem. Like, we are not overpopulated in terms of, our resources and what's available. We like the problem and the reason that we're creating so much pollution and everything is the way that we're going about living. And that has to do with, yeah, colonialism, capitalism, imperialism, etc. Like people just having children is not the problem. Like the way that we're living is the problem. And so if you don't want to have a child because you're like, whatever reason, it's like, yeah, cool. But don't think that you're solving the problem by not having
Mm-hmm.
a child and that other people are contributing to the
Mm-hmm.
problem by having that
Mm-hmm.
child. If you don't have a child, but you are like a Wall Street banker, like super perpetuating this like free market bullshit around the world, or like an economic hitman working for the World Bank or something like that, then you're doing far more damage than somebody who just has a child and is, you know,
Absolutely.
railing against these
Mm-hmm.
systems. So,
Yeah, I completely agree. Something else that I've been thinking about in terms of specifically veganism and the vision that mainstream veganism has currently of how it's going to make a difference for animals is that it's also inherently antinatalist. That was a bit of a mouthful. I'm going to explain what I mean. But when you're building your vegan praxis around the idea that you're promoting animal liberation by buying less animal products, like you know that you're not making a difference for I mean, I feel like no one really talks about this, but you're definitely not helping the conditions of the animals that are like currently alive or currently in the system, let alone the ones whose corpses are in your supermarket, right? So it's you're making like a rational argument towards lowering the demand. It's to help future animals not be bred, right? That is how we're going to decrease. If we decrease the demand for meat, then we are going to also decrease the number of animals that are brought into this life and slaughtered. And, that whole argument rests on the fact that it's really not worth being an animal being born in the conditions that we raise them, which is a point that I certainly would not argue with. I don't think if I were an animal, I would ever want to be born into the animal agriculture industry. But I just feel like that's not really an ambitious. I feel like if we limit our veganism to just not consuming animal products, that's not a very ambitious goal or like not a very inspiring vision, because it's just saying, okay, let's consume less animals so that we decrease the demand so that not as many animals are born into this horrible system, when really, what we want is total animal liberation. We want to
smash the system.
We want to smash the system down altogether. So when I I choose not to consume animal products. And I think at the beginning of my veganism, when I wasn't very knowledgeable about the way that capitalism worked, I really did think that lowering the demand for animal products would, free them. So when I first went vegan, I very much fell into that camp of wanting to do it as a consumer boycott, as a consumer activity, to obtain animal liberation through the complete obliteration of the need to slaughter them in the first place. Whereas now that I understand more how capitalism works, I choose to not eat animals just because it's a part of my anti-consumerist, anti-capitalist praxis. And so I just don't think the life of an animal life shouldn't be commoditized at all. And so veganism makes sense for that reason. It's like an ethical position. I'm not really doing it to lower the demand of meat. That being said, I understand wanting to lower the demand of meat on an ecological perspective, certainly, because obviously it's wildly unsustainable. But I'm just saying, in terms of animal liberation, the argument of lowering the demand for animal products doesn't really, it doesn't quite do it for me anymore. That's not why I'm not consuming those products. Because, the way that consumerism and production works, I don't actually think it's having an impact on the animals. And even if it is, that just means that the animals, so is our end goal just to have less of them being bred? I was thinking about this article that was really, that was being shared a lot across social media a couple of years ago that 400 million less animals had been killed this year than were last year. And I'm sure that a lot of vegans listening to this remember that article because that stat was really widely shared. And the thought that I had was like, well, I mean, I didn't have this at the time. I'm sure I shared the article at the time and thought that it was great. But, oh man. But thinking about it now, I question, okay, so if all the animals in the agriculture industry, we know that they are bred into existence and then they have this completely calibrated like number of days that they're going to live and be fattened up until they get slaughtered. No one is going to sadly know of their existence. And yeah, like it's almost like they were never here, right? Because they were never really, it's like hard to even make sense of what that existence symbolically means because there's billions and billions of animals in this horrible industry and no one will ever know of their suffering. And so if 100% of these animals are suffering and even if 400 million less of them are being bred into existence, still 100% of the animals in there are like, going to be bred and then slaughtered. So I don't understand why it makes a difference. It's like, like really meta to think about why we're even rejoicing about the stat of like 400 million less. It's like, it doesn't matter. It's 100%. It's all, even if there's like 2 animals in there, on an animal suffering, like animal liberation front, I just don't think it's a very good argument.
That's such a amazing point, and I never thought of it that way either. I mean, I was the same in that I started, when that kind of article came out, or when there used to be these memes that people would post being like, this year I saved this many animals and this many trees and this many whatever, and I'd be like, yeah, fuck yeah, that's what I did.
What did you do this year?
Too. Yeah. But it's so true that it's like, yeah, fine, okay, less of them are being bred and less of them are suffering, but like still, there's still billions of them suffering. Like 100% of them are still suffering. Like we're not actually dismantling these systems. We're just like slightly reducing them.
Right. And so, okay, we uselessly bring them into existence and we uselessly kill them, but we're still 100% of the ones we're breeding we're uselessly killing, and you know what I mean?
Right. Yeah. I don't know. I mean, like, I understand. I was watching Anastasia the otother day, and she's
a YouTuber.
Yeah, and she's brilliant. And yeah, she was talking about veganism and individualism and stuff, and saying that, like, this idea that a boycott is totally meaningless is also a bit like, it's not totally meaningless. And like, if everyone were to actually do this, then it would actually like have some impacts on this industry, and then we could start talking about, pushing for more or whatever. So I'm not saying that like it's totally fruitless. Or that like necessarily this is an individual action, because if all of us are doing it, it's not individual anymore, it's collective, and then we have some power, you know what I mean? But yeah, you're so right that it's like that can only be one small part of it. Like that can only be one part of our activism and everything, like, because it's not going to change the systems. They're going to keep growing, they're going to find new markets, they're going to find other things to do with these animals for profit. They're not just going to be like, okay, like let's give up now and whatever.
And that ultimately, if you're only advocating for veganism in the consumerist sense and trying to drive down demand, your argument is inherently anti-natalist and basically saying that these animals, it's not even, I feel like it just distracts us from looking at the cruelty of the system and the fact that we should change it altogether by just saying like, oh, well, they shouldn't be born, or like we're going to drive down demand for them being born. Like, yes, that's something that we need to do, but also that's really not the main. Yeah, that's not like the most important thing in terms of animal liberation, and I don't even think it's really the same. Like really the same argument.
And it's like, and if all these vegans, like if you really were concerned with having a population that would drive down demand for these animal products, then it's like, I don't know, how do you think that that's actually going to be reducing demand? Because demand is growing every year for meat, like regardless of kind of like what we're doing, right? So it's like you're not going to have a child and you think that that's actually going to reduce demand? Like
Mhm.
how? How?
Yeah. Right. And it's equating, I guess, it's monitoring the progress of animal liberation by how much demand there is for their meat. When that's just like not true,
Hmm.
because still 100% of the meat there is, those animals were bred in like incredibly cruel conditions.
Hmm.
So,
Yeah. I don't know. Yeah, I mean, it's like it's a hard thing to even wrap your mind around because it's like, I mean, because that is the vegan perspective. Like I was looking at veganism and antinatalism and the movements, and like there's so much overlap, and so many antinatalists are vegan, and so many vegans are antinatalist because vegans are saying like, well, if you're part of the antinatalist movement and you're not vegan, then you're a hypocrite because you're supporting an industry that keeps breeding and breeding and breeding all of these animals. And if you're antinatalist in terms of the human species, you should be antinatalist in terms of the
oh, I
animal
see.
species.
I did not know that was an argument.
Yeah, and then so the opposite is also true. Like antinatalists are like, well, if you're vegan, then you should be antinatalist because if your goal is to not do any harm and to do the least harm possible in terms of like harming animals, harming the planet and whatever, then you should also be antinatalist because if you're bringing more people into the world, then they might not be vegan, they might be doing harm, they're going to be causing environmental impact. And so like so those movements are like very tied together
Hmm.
and like that's their whole thinking.
Hmm.
And it's like if you kind of listen to it out of context, you're kind of like, okay, I can see the links, I can see why people are like, yes, this makes sense. But it's just ignoring the systems that we operate under completely.
Right.
And
And I feel
yeah.
like it's just, it's not actually honest or truth. Like, no one's gonna, then I don't want to be one of those antinatalist analists. um, it's like I slip almost. I like almost say that word every time I say anti-natalist because it's such a mouthful. We should call them
Anti-analyst.
analysts. Um,
Mhm.
like I just feel like it's like kind of it's just like not really honest. Like what? So they're not actually wishing any of the people around them die or they kill themselves or they like I, I yeah,
Mhm.
I just I don't know. I just don't feel like it's a for the vast majority of people like really and especially when they're like privileged white westerners. Um
Right. Well, it's like just reducing our population is not going to save
yeah.
animals, point blank.
Yes.
Like even if a ton of us reduce our populations, it's not going to save animals. Maybe less of them will be bred, maybe less of them will be
Hmm.
killed, but they will still be bred and killed for the population that is still
Right.
there. So you're not disrupting any of the systems by just reducing the
Yeah.
population. Like you have to attack the systems that are causing these problems, and
Absolutely.
capitalism is a big one of them. However, as I said on the Rev Left radio podcast, and I've said elsewhere, that doesn't mean that like socialism is the solution to animal suffering either. Like it has to be a concerted effort. Like if we have an alternative political economy, then we are obviously in a much better position to liberate animals because the profit motive seriously just makes that an impossibility. Same with like addressing the climate crisis. The profit motive makes that a serious impossibility. So if we're operating a system that isn't run by the profit motive and isn't run by endless growth and endless accumulation, then we can liberate animals. But it doesn't mean that like if we overthrew capitalism, then animals would just be
Hmm.
liberated. Like we have to actually do much more than that, and we have to actually have like an ethical movement and like talk about this and like plan and stuff like that. So just want to make that
Yeah,
point.
I completely agree. And I think that that's helping me understand where I'm kind of making the distinction. I like the point that you made also on that podcast of like, well, leftists should still go vegan because since it's so ecologically important, if leftists really want to have this revolution, they need to have an earth to have it on, right? And so even if it's not, we
Hmm.
shouldn't just wait for capitalism to be abolished to like actually go vegan because then what? We're gonna
Hmm.
have nothing left of this earth, you know? And
Yeah.
so I think that is the main that would would be my main argument for why people should go vegan as like a boycotting consumerist activity to decrease the demand for meat, because I think ecologically that's super important. In terms of just the ethical position of animal liberation, I think that just decreasing the demand for how bred they are is really doesn't go far enough. It's not ambitious enough, and it's certainly not like the vegan world that I'm envisioning, because I think that people should not eat animals and should not consume animal because they need to deconstruct like the whole speciesist notion that animals are consumable goods. And as you said, like that epiphany is not just going to come to them if one day the demand for meat completely decreases, like that really is, just like racism and sexism and all these other systems of oppression, there's like a huge ideological shift that needs to happen. So I think veganism as a consumerist activity is very pertinent in terms of reducing demands, and also just for yourself to live according to your values as much as possible, and to realize that just like you wouldn't eat a human because they're not like a consumable good, you don't want to eat an animal either for that same reason.
Yeah. No, that's really, really well said.
And also it's interesting when you think about how it's been argued by the animal agriculture industry, but also by people who eat meat, that if they weren't there to breed them, they wouldn't ever even like live, almost as an excuse to kill them and eat meat, because if it wasn't for them, those animals would have just never existed. So it's almost like this zero-sum game where like, well, it doesn't matter if they're here, it doesn't matter if they're not, which is the same thing that makes like the whole stat, the 400 million less animals being killed, completely sort of irrelevant. You're like, well, it's not, they could be here, they could not be here, they could, like, we only bring them into the world to like brutally exploit and murder them. So yeah, I feel like people on both sides of the argument are saying, well, either like that is not, so that's a reason to not eat meat, or that is a reason to eat meat, I guess, depending on whether or not you see it as like a net good to even be alive and breathe at all. But yeah. And like Temple Grandin, who's like, she's really famous, right?
I feel like she's famous in the vegan community, but other people might not know. So yeah, she developed
like this whole new system basically for how to slaughter animals, but kind of drive down the fear and the pain they felt when they were walking to slaughter and when they were slaughtered. So I think it's something about like making the conveyor belt that they walk on operate in this like circular pattern that makes them more dizzy or soothes them more. And so she was actually she was awarded the PETA Proggy Award a few years ago in 2014, I believe. Proggy stands for progress, and it's an award that seeks. I know. I was like, that's Proggy. I feel like that's an improbable name.
That's terrible.
Yeah. I don't know who helped them work on the branding of this award. But anyway, this Proggy Award recognizes people and companies that are trying to create a more humane world according to PETA. And so it caused a lot of controversy among vegans, the fact that Temple Grandin was getting this award. She's not even vegan, by the way, unless she's gone vegan since 2014. I didn't really follow up on that, but like she doesn't advocate for total animal liberation. She's just basically saying, well, since they're here, I actually have an exact quote from her. She said, "I was up on a catwalk over a whole sea of cattle. This was in the summer of 1990, and getting kind of upset about it." No shit. "And then I thought, none of those cattle would have been born if we had not bred them. They would never have existed at all. But we've got to give them a decent life." So either we're excused for animal suffering because we bred them and gave them the gift of life in the first place, or that, on the contrary, we have a moral obligation to stop eating them because we want to drive down like the need to breed them at all. I just feel like it creates this false dichotomy between it's just like this weird philosophical debate then about like whether or not it's worth living whether or not you should be antinatalist. It's just like these thought experiments that in the end, I just think are really irrelevant to the fact that we shouldn't really be trying to value different lives or define like what are morally relevant capacities for like being here at all, and what life is worth living and what life is not worth living, but instead just dismantle the systems and like try to understand why the fuck it is
Mm-hmm.
that these conditions are so horrible and really target that instead of just having a debate about whether or not it's worth living through them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, definitely. And I mean, like her little, tweaks that she made to that system, it's like, well, what is that really doing? Like, okay, great, they're gonna get dizzy and not maybe slightly less scared before they go to slaughter. They're still being
Yeah.
slaughtered, like, they're still living in horrible conditions and everything, right? So it's just like, so it's one of those things where it's like, well, that's not ambitious at
No.
all. You know what I mean? So it's like we're just trying to reduce the awfulness of these systems instead of being like, hey, why are they so awful? Like, why are people so alienated and so depressed and getting like increasing, anxiety and everything like that? Like, why are people unable to live in this system anymore? Yeah, because it's a horrible system. It's just like, instead of being like, is it worth it to live? It's like, well, is it worth it to live under what
Mm-hmm.
conditions? Under what conditions? And like, can we change the conditions, or are we just gonna give up?
Mm-hmm.
Like,
Yeah, it's just so utilitarian, like thinking that we can have a quantifiable measure of how much suffering there is in life and how we can maximize non-suffering, and just all these calculations and thought experiments for how we're going to do so.
Mhm. But also it's like, but what is the cause of suffering? And because like in that Benatar article, it was like filling out forms and waiting in line, like that, these are not looking at the causes, like the systemic causes of
Hmm.
suffering, right? So it's just like, yeah, forget about trying to quantify suffering. Just look at like what is causing people to
Hmm.
suffer, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah, totally. It's this like hyper rational, again, androcentric way to think about life. And I agree with what you were saying in the beginning of like, I understand making those calculations for yourself in the current system that you're living in trying to decide whether or not you want to bring a kid into the world.
Mm-hmm.
But there's a big difference between personally reflecting on that and advocating for it as like a policy change, especially because that leads to a whole
Mm-hmm.
fucked up things like forced sterilization of certain people and forced sterilization of pets. Can we talk about that for a second? Um,
Yeah.
yeah, like spaying and neutering, I get that it's necessary, with my little knowledge on it, but I understand like why it's necessary in the pet industry currently. And a lot of arguments in favor of spaying and neutering is that our population of cats and dogs, and domestic animals in general is way, way too large for our society, and so rates of euthanasia for pets is really, really high, and so spaying and neutering your pet and keeping them from reproducing will decrease suffering because it'll decrease euthanasia rates and pets that have to live on the streets in horrible conditions and so on and so forth. And like, again, I understand that argument, but I also think that spaying and neutering should also be a practice that is examined under debates of bodily autonomy, and personhood, and just like consent, for the animals. And here I just want to shout out a really great episode by the Vegan Warrior Princesses Attack called Bodily Autonomy, I think, where they discussed this more in length.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but but all this to say that talking about spaying and neutering just in terms of like overpopulation, and antinatalism really fails to critically examine why we have this overpopulation of pets in the first place and why we started domesticating these
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
animals, and selling them for profit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and then like the whole like pet stores and breeders, and once again back to capitalism, and like, yeah, why they're being bred and how.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I don't know. There's just very uncomfortable parallels between like spaying and neutering for me and like forced sterilization of humans too. Not saying that I'm like against spaying and neutering in the current whatever in the current system that we live in, but yeah.
Yeah, it's hard. Yeah, it's like hard to think about like where I would fall on that really, because it's like, I mean, yeah, I guess like within this system, yeah, I don't know. I
Yeah.
don't know.
No, it's hard. Yeah, Laura Schleifer, the woman I interviewed a few episodes back on Israel and vegan washing, posted a video to her Facebook page not long ago, and it was a family of cats, and it was so cute. We need to link this in our show notes, but it was like, not that animals have like concepts of gender like this, but it looked like a mom and a dad and like the little kids. And her caption was saying like, we never see this. We never see families of domesticated animals with their babies because we force them to not ever know each other, and we forcibly also spay and neuter them, and I don't even have an idea of how really a family of cat lives. Like, I guess a mom with her children, and who knows if it's a mom, and who knows, anyway, I deconstructed all of that in my videos on the gender binary.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, because then like even the families that they do have, like the breeders, they obviously have families, but then the babies are taken away
Yeah.
and sold, so it's kind of sad.
Yeah, and all like, yeah, brothers and sisters or siblings. I should stop gendering them for no reasons. Siblings are also, separated from each other, and I think it is. I think not questioning the practice of forcibly sterilizing animals is like super speciesist. Even though that's not to say that, God fucking knows what we should do instead in this current. I think as a vegan, God, I don't know. The utilitarian side of me would say like, well, it is important to like spay and neuter them and like limit the overpopulation of pets. But in terms of like animal liberation and like seeing them as autonomous beings with personhood, am I pro spaying and neutering them? Like, no. So.
I know. That's like, I feel like pets is like a tough one for vegans because like, yeah, I'm a vegan, but like I have pets and I love my pets and they're obviously spayed and neutered, and it's just like, but yeah, no, it's true. It's like it's the utilitarian within this system, but then it's hard because we're so inculcated into this system, so it's hard to imagine another system where they would just be free to just do whatever they want and like still have relationships with us and stuff.
Totally. And since we are responsible for like domesticating them and bringing them into our lives, like, our pets, I don't know, I hate that term. Like, they're not our pets, they're like our companions and family members. I had a family member who was a cat way back when, but unfortunately they are no longer among us. But like, yeah, in terms of your dogs, like, it's certainly, I think, would be wrong to just say, well, no, it's bad to have pets and it's inherently exploitative, because like they're here and they're just family members.
Yeah. But they were taken away from their mom and like they will not be able to have families of their own. So yeah, there is all these things where it's like, yeah, it's hard when you're like in the system to even imagine another system where like imagine what liberation would look like, because, and I feel like that's the same with capitalism. Like, you're just so inculcated with this system that it's like hard to imagine like, okay, what is liberation, but those are like really important things to think about when we do think about animal liberation, especially in a post-capitalist world.
Yeah. And like step one would be to not buy pets from breeders.
Oh yeah. Definitely.
Yeah, obviously. But anyway, there's a lot of like literature on that, so we will let that speak for itself.
And speaking of post-capitalism, maybe this is a good segue.
It's a great segue.
Okay. Speaking of post-capitalism, yeah, I wanted to talk a bit about the relationship between antinatalism and anti-capitalism. So I've seen like two sides of the story here. I've seen anti-capitalists. I've actually seen a lot of anti-capitalists who are antinatalist, or who at least express that they really don't want kids, especially in this system. I have seen the other as well, the other side that says that this is a defeatist point of view. Like I was saying earlier, if we're going to talk about the value of life, we should talk about the material conditions. We should talk about under what conditions, and we should be fighting to change those conditions, not necessarily saying that, as a political act, I'm going to just not have a child. But again, I think that's part of the whole, like, is it part of your arsenal, or is it an end in itself, right? Because it's like, well, maybe that could be part of your arsenal, but not an end to itself.
Hmm.
But anyway, so the anti-capitalist arguments for antinatalism are, number one, that if you're a proletarian family, then you are likely going to have proletarian children, and therefore they will just be wage laborers and they will suffer under the system of wage labor. And so, yeah, why would you bring in a new child who's just going to suffer as a worker and be alienated? And yeah, the second argument is that it's almost kind of like a political act to kind of screw over the capitalists by not having children. So you're not giving them a workforce, like trying to, I guess, reduce that reserve army of labor, and also reduce the number of consumers that would be part of the system. Although, yeah, I'm not sure, how effective that would be at really like bringing capitalism to its knees. Like, it's true that the system runs into trouble when the populations decrease. That's why we're seeing all these, pro-natalist government policies coming in. I think to some extent, reducing the workforce with respect to the capitalists would give that workforce slightly more power. Like if there wasn't this huge reserve army of labor and there was a smaller number of people available to work, then the collective power of those workers would increase. Like they could demand better wages, they
Hmm.
could choose between employers instead of having to just like scramble for whatever employer will give them any wage that will keep them alive. So in that sense, I'm like, okay, that might be something. Again, it's one of those things where I feel like, it's kind of like the vegan thing. It's like that might slightly reduce the labor force. It might not. And
Hmm.
it might not really help, especially as automation advances, because then if the robots are doing the job, then the smaller workforce is still going to be part of that reserve pool, and they're still going to be exploited. So I don't know about that one. And then there's just the argument that, late stage capitalism is crumbling and it's not going to be able to provide security or, just good conditions of life at all for the next generation, which is something that I can resonate with. I'm like, yeah,
Hmm.
I can
Hmm.
see that. Like, so that one kind of resonates with how I felt most of my life, being like, well, the environment is crashing, the economy is trash, so I feel like the next generation will have it pretty rough. Like, I'm not going to sugarcoat that. Like, they probably will. Um,
I mean, yeah, the thought of just being around in 50 years actually terrifies me.
yeah,
I see how quickly we are running into the wall, and the wall is so much closer than we even realized it was 2 years
yeah,
ago, that I just bringing another human into the world that will definitely live past like 2100. I
yeah,
Man, if I ever like decide to have kids, that's going to be really something that I have to grapple
yeah.
with.
No,
I'm going to bring them into the world and be like, I'm so sorry.
I know, no, it like it pains me to think about, because I'm like, yeah, like because part of me now is like, yeah, I kind of would like to have a child, or adopt or whatever, but I'm like, well, I guess adopting is different, but yeah, just like having another child is like, yeah, I mean, it would be rough to think about all these things.
Hmm.
However, I mean, I think antinatalism, as like, I think in that case, if you're just thinking about your own personal choice, I think that that makes total sense. But
Yeah,
if you're
I
looking at
agree.
it as some kind of a like political movement against capitalism to not have children, I don't think that's a solution at all. I don't think that's really going to help. Um, So yeah, I mean, and again, it's like if that's part of your arsenal, then like okay, cool. Maybe you're like I'm doing this because I think this might reduce the workforce and might give future proletariat more power. Okay, but I mean, you better be going far above and beyond that, or it is just
Hmm.
kind of defeatist, and it is just saying like the only way out of capitalism is just to not be born into it at all.
Exactly, exactly. And I think that already, like, capitalism has really stripped our imagination and our, like, yeah, just, we always talk about how difficult it is to envision something
Hmm.
else. But I think, if anything, anti-natalism is like, it shuts that door a second time of just like, well, just don't be
Yeah.
born and just advocate for other people, not letting anyone be
Right,
born,
exactly.
And I feel like it does that to a certain extent with veganism and animals too. If veganism is only about animals just like not being born, it's like that doesn't actually dismantle the species as system.
Exactly. And it just divides us even further because then it turns us against one another. Because then we're just looking at each other being like, oh, that person has 4 children. What, you know,
Yeah.
how irresponsible.
Uncontrollable loose cannon.
Yeah, but like how irresponsible. Like that's
Yeah.
disgusting. Like now I have to have no children just to offset the 2 extra ones that she
Yeah.
had plus the replacement rate. It's
Yeah.
all of these calculations are ridiculous.
Yeah.
You know?
No, I mean, so the founder of Vegan Publishers, called Casey Tyler, I think Tyler is his last name. I always call him Casey. But he had a child, I think like 3, 4 years ago, and then now he's just had a second baby. I know that he's very passionate about like denouncing the horrible, toxic environment around antinatalism and the vegan movement, because he has like had to put up with so much shit. And also, he regularly posts screenshots of like what other people say in vegan groups about literally how we should kill women who want to have children or who have children. Oh no, like vile
Oh
things.
my God.
Like advocating for violence against like humans who decide to have kids. I really did not. Yeah, I realized it was bad, but I didn't realize like how like
Mm-hmm.
virulent is
Mm-hmm.
virulent a word
Yeah.
in English? How
Yeah.
virulent the antinatalism really was in a lot of vegan circles.
Mm-hmm.
It's
I think in a lot of anti-capitalist spaces as well, or just in general, like just general antinatalism. I mean, even like before I was vegan, like when I was younger, I was a teenager when I was in my early 20s, and I was on the kind of like environmental train, and I was like, oh yeah, we should not be having children. If I saw a person, I would have this idea that like if a couple had 2 kids, I'm like, okay, that's fine because that's replacement rate. Like you're not like creating or destroying, you're like replacing. But if you had
mhm,
more than 2, I was just like, what are you thinking? Like, people who had like
totally.
4, I would lose it. But then I'm just like, no, like these people are not the problem. like these
Hmm.
children are not the problem. And like other people are choosing not to have kids. Like it's not, you know what I mean? It's not this zero sum game. It's, yeah, the systems are the problem. And like not
Hmm.
being born at all doesn't solve shit other than
Hmm.
you aren't here to experience it.
Hmm.
I don't know.
And if anything, I'd much rather people who don't have our like lifestyle and our carbon emissions have children than like
Right.
people in our countries having children. Like,
Exactly.
honestly, I mean, yeah, very honestly, between you and me, and admittedly everyone who's listening, I do like when I just see friends of mine, like, or people in my entourage,
Hmm.
unquestioningly having kids. I do,
Hmm.
I guess, more than, it's not that I'm judgmental of it, it's just that I'm like, wow, we have a very different, we're living in different worlds with different
Yeah, yeah,
preoccupations,
yeah, yeah.
of just, I kind of wish I was in the mind state of like still being so optimistic and uninformed
Hmm.
to think like, oh, a kid, it is a great, beautiful, like thing to have a kid in this world, and that kid is going to have a great life.
Oh yeah.
Um, because I'm just like so pessimistic about like where the world is going.
No, I fully agree. I definitely look at like people around me sometimes, like even my mom sometimes. I'm always just amazed that like she's just so disconnected from politics and everything. And I'm like,
Mm-hmm.
what a happy existence. Like she really just like gets up, like does her stuff, like watches some shows, like has her kids, like has her whatever, and then like goes to bed. You know what I mean? Like there
Mm-hmm.
aren't, yeah. So I definitely see where you're coming from. I do understand where, yeah, it's like people who are around me, like just having babies, like, and not just totally uncritically, like totally
Totally,
like
yeah.
not a care in the world. Like this is just a normal thing to do, blah, blah, blah. Gonna go to my job now, gonna come home now, gonna relax, gonna go to bed, gonna do it again in the morning.
Mm-hmm.
And that's it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's just like, yeah, we're living in different worlds or like,
Yeah. Yeah. Completely.
yeah. Yeah. But having said that, it's like, yeah, I'm like, obviously, like they are not the problem, and I think that's the difference in a lot of these movements,
Mm-hmm.
where it's like people start to think of themselves as being hyper moral because they're doing this
Yeah.
thing, and just
Mm-hmm.
not understanding that like they're not helping, and like also they're blaming the wrong things for the problems of the world.
Right. It's not revolutionary to be anti-natalist.
No,
Like it's just not.
it's absolutely not. And like humanity is not one undifferentiated mass that is all this like rational economic subject that is destroying the
Mm-hmm.
world. Like there are so many different cultures, so many different people around the world who are not living this way, who are not contributing to this kind of bullshit. So it's like hashtag not all humans, you know what I mean? It's not just like more humans equals more destruction. It's like more humans with this mindset. So what are we doing to change this mindset and change how we're living, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, 100%.
So yeah, I mean, I guess that's all I really have to say about that.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
definitely check out Mexi's video on overpopulation.
And definitely check out Marine's video. I was gonna say a privileged vegan, so I'm like, that sounds weird. Marine's
Yeah, I
video.
was thinking we never like say the name of our channels on this podcast.
Yeah.
Well, I guess especially privileged vegan because Mexi's just your name.
Yeah.
But still, yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
We'll link them all below, so check out the videos on A Privileged
definitely.
Vegan and Mexi.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll put my adoption one. I'm just not so sure we'll talk because I made a video. This was like oh my God, this was my first video as a privileged vegan
Wow.
on free because Freely, my home girl from back in the day, made this very gross video about about how she thinks that families should give a proof of income before they're allowed to have children because they need to like have money to take care of them. Yeah, it's like so fucked up.
Mm.
Um, I don't think there's anything more like classist or racist than saying such a thing.
Hmm.
But so I made a video kind of dismantling the myth of overpopulation, but it
Hmm.
was actually, I mean, the content of the video is still good, but it's just funny because I was filming on like my computer and like very obviously reading from my script and like talking
Hmm.
very
Hmm.
slowly and
Yeah. Oh, girl,
yeah,
all my old videos are terrible like
yeah,
that. But let's include it. If the content's good, let's include it.
yeah, for
Um,
sure.
so we have a number of new patrons to shout out, and I hope you all are loving the sound of Marine's
Oh yeah, we should
voice
have announced this.
now because she has a brand new mic. It's super
The
smooth.
same mic as Mexi.
Hmm. And that's thanks to all the patron donations. So I want to say thank you to Debbie Lewis, Selena Noriega, Megan. Shout out Megan. That's actually my real name. Whoa.
Hmm.
Casey Balmer, who also edited their pledge to be a larger pledge. So thank you, Casey. And Lena Paulus. So
Wow,
yeah,
that's a lot.
it's a lot. Yeah, thank you so much to everyone who's donated. If you want to support the show, please go to veganvanguardpodcast.com. You can support us via Patreon, becoming a monthly donor, or you can make a one-time pledge via PayPal, or you can rate and review us on iTunes or Google
Hmm.
Play or whatever. We love seeing the reviews. They make our day.
Hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah, we got a comment recently. about asking us why we weren't on Spotify.
Oh yeah, I'm gonna look into that again. It's because Spotify, you have to apply to be on there, and I applied when we had first started the podcast, but we didn't have any episodes to show of, and so yeah, like they don't like they're not like iTunes or Google Play or whatever, where
Okay.
they don't actually let every podcast on their platform. So I have to apply again, and I feel like now that we have more episodes, then maybe
Mm-hmm.
we'll have a better chance of getting it. So I will try.
Okay. So it's not like a free sharing platform, like.
Yeah, it's not like they just accept all the podcasts. So anyway, so we'll try.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for listening.
Thanks everyone. Yep. Bye.